All right. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Shulo of Association Analytics. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our virtual discussion series, where we bring together leaders and learners each week in a fun and engaging sessions aimed to optimize business results and staying relevant in challenging times. Today's session is about foundational data projects, and it is critical to association's analytics success. That's a tongue twister. We'll look at some real life examples, some lessons learned, and take away some practical tips on how to come out stronger when we all return to what will be normal. Just a note that this is recorded and will be shared. During the session, we'd love to hear from you. We already have people in the chat. Tim's always the first one, so thank you. But please participate in saying hi to your peers. We also have a Q&A that'll go directly to the panel, so feel free to ask any questions during any point in today's virtual discussion. Now I'd like to introduce the presenters. We have some good ones today. So first, Catherine Matthews. Catherine Matthews is a manager of data and analytics for the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, also a mouthful, and is a passionate data evangelist. In her work for NCARB, she helps the team to find and leverage insights in their data while supporting a self-service approach to analytics. Outside of NCARB, she's enthusiastic about sharing her knowledge about industry conferences and helping at industry conferences, not about them, although she probably knows about them too, and helping to organize meetups for the data curious in the association community, much like everyone gathered here today. She's also currently serving as chair of ASAE's Technology Professional Council Advisory Council. All right, Evan Reed. So Evan is the data and analytics manager at American Speech Language Hearing Association. Many of us know it as ASHA. Evan is a proud data nerd, as many of us, I'm sure, with extensive experience in collaborative data analysis, governance, data visualization, data collection, and processing, and program evaluation. And we also have Bill Conforti. Bill is the Senior VP of Strategy and Solutions with over 20 years of experience in software products and services. At Association Analytics, he works closely with clients and prospects, as well as internal development and delivery teams, and is always looking for the next cool feature to add to Acumen, our analytics platform built for associations. For those of you just joining us, make sure you grab a drink. I have my iced coffee today. And with that, I will turn it over to Bill.
Okay, yes, we talked a couple of times already about getting your drinks in hand, so go ahead and do that if you haven't done it yet. Introduce yourself in the chat. I see a lot of people are doing that already. Catch up, put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer those throughout. We're also going to experiment with a couple of polls in today's presentation, so we'll thank you in advance for your participation in those. Yeah, so we have some good content to present today. We have two speakers, both of them, Evan and Catherine as well, data nerds. They're going to educate you on some of the fundamentals of data and analytics and kind of make it relevant to today's situation as well. So on the agenda, we have a quick introduction where I'm going to recap some of the things that we went over in the past few weeks as an introduction to today's content. We'll take a high-level look into data governance as well as adoption and culture around analytics. We're going to talk about the importance of knowing where to find data and how to map that for integration in your organization. We'll talk about taxonomy and tagging. So this is where we can use our content and help us to understand preferences and interests of our members and our constituents based on all the touch points and all the interactions that you have with those members. And finally, some key takeaways. We'll summarize what you learned and we'll give you some practical tips on how to get started. Okay, so let's start off with some member participation right off the bat. We're going to start with our first poll question, which is, what is the #1 obstacle to progress on analytics initiatives in your association? So everybody should see the poll popping up on your screen. If you can take a second to look at that and give us your best answer. And so while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and quickly recap some of the things that we've talked about over the last few weeks. I do want to mention that if you missed any of this, the recordings are available from the registration landing page. And we'll ask Brian, if you don't mind, to put the link for that in the chat so everybody can grab those recordings if you're interested in doing that. So our goal in the discussion series up to this point was to highlight some of the ways to use data to optimize your results and stay relevant and top of mind for members, especially during the current circumstance. So in week one, we looked at market basket analysis, right? We looked at how to apply this to your product and to your event sales. And, we basically learned, when members buy Tostitos, don't discount the salsa, right? They're going to buy that anyway. We looked at some other creative things for ways that you could bundle and price your products and services based on market basket. Okay, we looked at network analysis. This is how you can identify influencers. And by this, we mean not just people, but also products, right? So the idea here being that you find those influential products and you build bundles and tracks around them. So week two, we looked at ways to optimize your revenue streams and to potentially find new ones. So what products can potentially offset some of that revenue that you've lost from the cancellation of your meeting? We looked at new revenue opportunities, some really good ones, a content subscription idea from ONS, which is basically they're taking some of their high value content and bundling it. And so it's creating high value for the members, as well as some short-term revenue opportunities for the association. Then we looked at sponsored ad retargeting. So this is basically keeping your sponsors in touch with your constituents, and giving them that access where they might have lost that and they would have only had it through an in-person meeting. Okay, and last week we looked at how to get creative with virtual events, right? So we started with event analysis. We looked at registration counts, to see what percentage of your customers or your members are affected by the cancellation of your event. We looked at revenue from registrations, sponsorships, and exhibits. And we talked about the importance of understanding overlap, right? When this is where we look at what is the overlap between your in-person events and your virtual events. And then lastly, we looked at community data. We learned from this that it's great for content guidance, as well as for finding experts and finding influencers who might be speakers or volunteers in our virtual events. And so all of that helped us, kind of understand how we could stage a virtual event, a winning virtual event. And it's suitable for our goals, for our audience, and of course for our budget, right? Because we know that there's budgets of all sizes. And so a fun thing is, one of the things we learned here is we don't want to call our events webinars, right? Webinars are things that members expect to have for free. And so there was a conversation around what should be the name for these kinds of things, right? Virtual event. And there was a lot of them were kind of straightforward. There was a lot of plays on Zoom things, Zoom stock, zooming in. Zumba is a fun one. Talking heads, some people wanted to keep it casual. So we had shindigs, hangouts, jam sessions, and just right up here, that's kind of got truncated a little bit, but my personal favorite was water torture. So if anybody is on the call today that's responsible for that one, take credit for it. You deserve it. All right. And so with all of that, you probably noticed that, a lot of what we showed was kind of pretty charts and graphs. So all the data that we needed was kind of all there in one place, and we kind of made it look easy, right? So this is the after picture that we show. But for a lot of us, it's more like the before picture, right? So we have AMS exports, we have tables, we have Excel sheets. They're all in different locations, different levels of quality of that data, and it's difficult to find what we need. And not to mention that there aren't really any standards oftentimes for how we deal with that data and how we manage it. So what prevents us, from being more like the before and not the after, right? So that's kind of a good segue. So I'm ask Brian to put up the answer to our poll question. So for this group, the answer is lack of time. Interestingly enough, close second, we have lack of knowledge and skills. So I'm going to pause for a second there and put our panelists on the spot and ask for a reaction to that. Any surprises there, Evan or Catherine?
I think, right out of the gate, I noticed that there isn't really an issue for most folks around executive support. that there is an interest for this and it's coming from the top, but we're running into roadblocks along the way.
As I was trying to punch in an answer to this and realizing that presenters couldn't answer, I was going for lack of time because that seems to be our main impediment. But I think the lack of skill response is fairly interesting in that a lot of what we've talked about discussing today is kind of the low skill, low energy, time efficient approach to data management. The type of data governance that you can put in place and you can think about in your bathrobe and your slippers, and you don't need a degree to complete.
All right. And would you guys say that this is pretty consistent with how you would answer it? I'm sure the two of you would say lack of time is probably number one. What about budget? Is budget an issue for either of your orgs?
Depends on the scope of what we're trying to pursue.
Yeah.
There's not a blank check for a data management system, but the time's really the big thing. Because if you want to get super deep into cleaning your data, you can spend 80–90% of your time just dedicated to that, but nobody can really do that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think lack of budget, certainly more money. I'll take more money. You know, want to give me that blank check for analytics? Absolutely. But I think there's often sort of like a trade-off between that time and budget piece. Less budget means spending more time doing things kind of the hard way. So you kind of
probably costing more.
Yeah, you have to optimize for both.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, so despite those limitations, right, for budget or time or maybe even knowledge and skills, I think we can still make some progress, right? And so when I was thinking through this, the quarantine time and sort of the things that we're spending time on, maybe think of getting your house in order, right? Doing organization type things. So in the chat, if anyone has tackled a big home organization project, cleaned out your garage or something like that, be interested to hear about that. But so for me, I sorted out the spice cabinet, right? So we have the before and after here. That's not actually my cabinet. I was telling Evan that I was going to put pictures of mine, but it already is a little bit messed up. And so I didn't think that would tell the story the way I wanted to. But in any case, right, so do you sort it by cuisine? Do you sort it by the size of the containers? There are lots of different things you could choose. I mean, I ended up going with frequency of use, right? So the ones I need all the time, I put in the front, regardless of kind of what cuisine it was. But, so as you think about this, though, there are a lot of duplicates, right? So, and these are things that you see when you do data, right? There are a lot of duplicates. You had to merge those. You have two parsleys, right? You have to put those both into the same bottle. Tons of expired things. So a lot of these, things from like 2014, right? They really shouldn't be in there anymore. So you have to get rid of those, right? They're records that are no good anymore. And some were not clearly marked, right? So they're just these blank glass containers with, random things, and you're not really sure what they are. So you have to label them, right? If you know what they are. So these are not unlike some of the kinds of things that you do with your data. And so one of the, silver linings, if you can find one in the current situation where we're sheltering in place, is that, offices or garages, storage rooms, all of that, they're binned, they're sorted, they're labeled, right? So we're kind of, we're more clean and more organized than we've been in years. And I think that we can take some of those lessons and we can kind of, get our data houses in order as well, right? And so all those things that we're talking about, right? Organizing, cleaning, deduping, all those kinds of things. Those are all sort of subsections of a broad category of data governance. And so I'm going to do one more quick poll question, and this is going to be related to governance. And that is quite simply, does your association have a data governance policy?
While folks are answering, as a fun fact, so yes, clean out projects are very popular right now. Our neighborhood actually put out a friendly PSA to the residents saying, "Dear God, please stop, as the trash trucks are filling up before they can finish their routes."
All right. Good. Okay. So while you guys are answering, I'm just going to do a quick minute or so as a primer on data governance, and then I'm going to stop talking for most of the rest of the presentation. So what is governance anyway, right? It's how we manage data issues related to things like data quality, privacy and security, definitions, right? So common language and context around the things that we want to analyze. It's how we establish ownership and sort of maintain ownership and responsibility and stewardship for our data, and usage, right? So what are the things we can use that data for? What's appropriate? So it improves the value and quality of our data while reducing the confusion and risk. All right, this one is from Mark Lowry, the 4 Ps of data governance. So when you think about that, those 4 Ps, people, right? So you have to decide who's going to make the decisions, who's going to manage the process, who's going to be in charge, or who's going to be the gatekeeper for the data and the reports. Process, right? So how will issues or requests be submitted? How will they be managed? How will decisions be made and tracked? Things like that. The plan, this is for the PMs, right? So what are the actions that are needed to design and implement DG policies, right? So this is kind of just basically a project plan for how we're going to get to the end state that we plan out. And then policy, right? So what are the rules that are needed to protect the data and increase the data value? So speaking of data policies, I want to go to now our poll results and see how we're doing in the audience with our data governance policies. Yes, wow, it's very evenly split there, right? So about 20% of us have that. So congratulations to you. Another 20 have it in progress, right? So we're over 40% are kind of in the process. Another 26 on the radar. So that's really great to hear. So what is a data governance policy? For those of you that are in that 24%, I do encourage you to, in the resource section, to take a look at our ultimate guide to data governance. That's available on the AT website, and there's lots of materials out there for how you can get started with governance and kind of learn the basics. If you look up any of us, we'd be happy to help you. And then for the people in the not happening anytime soon, 8%, yeah, I just would like to ask you if you can offer any insight into why that is, right? If it's not important, or there's really just so many other things that have to be tackled before that. That would be interesting. If you could maybe jump in the chat and tell us about that, that would be great. Because one of the key messages for all of this, and Evan and Catherine will reinforce that as we go through, is that most of the things that we think about and that we do related to governance are quite foundational. So usually it's the other way around. It's like we can't do anything else until we do governance, so this is a little bit surprising. So anyway, thanks for the responses, and we look forward to some clarification. So anyway, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. I'm wondering, and we'll sort of set up their comments with this question. So as it relates to data, what are some things that, and I'll actually add to it. So what are some things that you've been doing well, and then leading up to sort of March 2020, where things changed for all of us, what are some things that you wish you had in place prior to that that would have made things easier now, right? And so, and as you guys hear the comments, it'll be obvious that these are from the analyst perspective, right? These guys are quite adept, with dealing with data more so than most of us on the call. But we'll be able to also understand the benefits that the rest of us, right, the business users would have as a result of some of these things as well. So let's let Evan take a shot at this first.
Yeah, definitely. So thinking about some of the things that we've been doing well recently when it comes to data management would revolve around QC and cleaning cycles we've been putting in place around large analytics. We've been working to pull together a data stewardship group across the association, which, to be honest, is probably the hardest cultural thing that I have done in the 2 years that I've been at ASHA. There's a lot of interest in it, but trying to divvy up the workload and figure out how that team can be effective is proving to be, somewhat complicated. Going into pandemic times, some of the things that I'd wish that we'd kind of cleaned up a little bit. Working on our reporting processes, from setting up standardized request for reporting forms or a way to contact the data analytics team to request reporting, versus the kind of large spam of requests that we got as we started going remote and everyone was scrambling to better define the groups of the membership that they serve. It would have made my team's life a bit easier. Larger Power BI adoption. We've been using Power BI quite a bit in the organization, but we rolled out the results of our first member survey for the impacts of COVID-19 in Power BI. And we were kind of training people on the system on the fly as they were trying to access the data. So we probably could have had a little bit of easier access there. We still have a lot of trouble getting access to data that's held in vendor databases that doesn't have a set integration with our AMS or our core systems. And we've had a couple of instances where, being remote, we just haven't had access to data that we could have used to make better decisions. We're working on different ways to document changes to databases, to data structures, so that they're more apparent to data users. We're rolling out some new initiatives in response to COVID-19. Better documentation in place there would have made it a little easier to report out on that new data structure, incorporate that into other processes. And then, kind of as always, trying to define key member cohorts the same way with more than one group, which is virtually impossible, but coming up with some set definitions can make the reporting process a bit easier. So,
All right.
Those would be mine.
Thanks, Evan. Okay.
Yeah, so at NCARB, a lot of similar things. I mean, I think at a broad level, a lot of us are kind of in the same spot right now when it comes to having the analytics support for all of the new questions that are being asked right now. And so it's very exciting. We're getting a little bit more spotlight than we're used to, but there is also certainly some pressure to keep up. And some of the things that we'd been working on kind of all last year, and if only I had known the exact date that the pandemic would arrive, I would have prioritized accordingly. But one of the big ones is the new data warehouse. We have an existing data warehousing pipeline that's probably 6 or 7 years old at this point. It's robust and it's lovely, but it's not everything we need it to be. And so we're in the sort of final stages of getting the new pipeline and warehouse operational. Sounds kind of like I'm talking about the Death Star, even though it's no longer May the 4th. But it would be nice if that project had been finished so that we could be enjoying the fruits of our labor and having access to all of this nice, neat, and tidy data, which ties into the second one that's up here on the slide. We've had Tableau online for a similar amount of time, and as a result, there's a lot of cruft in there. It's just a lot of stuff that we're not using, or a lot of stuff that there's 4 different versions of, and none of them are necessarily wrong, but you still it doesn't build that confidence when you go in looking for something if you are stuck at the just picking which one to look at point. So getting that cleaned up has become newly a higher priority, I think. And then the last one was kind of interesting with the reporting requests that have been coming in around COVID. We're seeing a lot more interest in trends and looking further and further back to really get a sense of what the pattern that we should be looking for is. What is normal? What was normal last year, and was that the same as the year before? Is that the same as the 5-year average? In some cases, we have data that can go back to the recession in 2008, and so there's interest in looking at that far back to see how we did last time the economy was in a bad spot. So those are the 3 big things that I think would have made it a little easier for me to hide on my deck with a tiki drink while everybody else was scrambling.
But before we move on, Evan, I wanted to ask you about your experience also with demand, right? So Catherine mentioned there's been, some uniqueness, right, to the kind of requests that you're getting in the current situation. Is that also true for you? And what have you noticed about the overall demand for requests for data and reports?
Yeah, it's definitely true, in at least the way that we're approaching our work. My team also assists with developing email lists and marketing outreach lists and everything to guide the organization's communications. All of that pretty much went kaboom when we went remote, because all of the messaging changed, all of the groups changed, and we were really scrambling to work on that. We've definitely had a higher demand for reporting, and Catherine's historical piece is spot on. The data warehouse that we maintain is a current warehouse. It looks at the current status of members, and trying to draw historical data out of that for us is a bit complicated. We have other databases that we can fall back to, but that requires kind of taking a different reporting approach. And the other big change that we've seen is we've partnered up a lot more closely with our surveys and research team to help them handle these like large membership surveys and push that data into Power BI, into visualizations, into a different way for the organization to digest the kind of large amounts of data that we're getting back from the membership. So we've been putting a lot of effort in that space.
Good, thanks. So before we move on to things that we can, kind of looked at some things we wish we had done. Now what we can do in the current situation moving forward, as we start to look at those things, there's kind of one key topic that maybe is the most important topic of all, and you hear about it a lot. Without this, even the best solutions that we can come up with won't provide much value. I'm sure you all know what I'm about to go to here. It's adoption, right? So we're going to scratch the surface here, but I want to give Evan and Catherine a chance to talk about adoption. So let's go to Evan first and talk about what you found to be some of the keys to adoption in ASHA.
Gotcha. So as I mentioned before, this is honestly one of the hardest culture things that I have done at ASHA. And we've been bringing people from across the organization together to start talking about data governance. We've been working to come up with our kind of key data handling tenets, which we're planning to do like a poster campaign across the organization to get people to start thinking about those. But when it really comes down to assigning work, the data cleaning piece, it's a bit harder to get people's time and get their focus onto these data cleaning tasks. But the biggest thing that I have been stressing at ASHA is the data stewardship isn't the job of one person. It's not the job of one team. It's a mindset that the entire culture has to adopt and be aware of and be willing to kind of pitch in and help out with, because the end result of that culture shift is that you have better data, and that data can be used to better meet your needs, your analytical needs, your reporting needs, and answer people's questions with data faster and more comprehensively. But it's also important to think about this not in a, we have to put data governance in place, it's going to be a one-time thing, here are the rules, everyone's going to abide by them piece. This is something that can start small, it can start organically, and it's something that we're driving it from the analyst perspective, really, because we're running into these data cleanliness issues, or not being able to find a data source or understand a data source when we're going to do analysis. That analysis, that reporting can be used as a reward to get people into the data governance mindset. So if you're starting small, you have a team that has a particular need around analytics and reporting, but there's a hole in the data, there are problems with the data that you're trying to approach, you can't find the data or understand the data, work with that team to have them put some governance around that. Define the data set, clean it up a little bit so that it meets their reporting needs. Not all of them, clean a little bit, do some reporting, clean a bit more, provide more reporting, so that the team that's putting the time and effort into data governance is seeing the result of that effort in their analytics. It's something that they can kind of grab onto and understand the benefit of these data governance structures. Because having someone go in and clean a data set, it's great. They've got a clean data set, but unless you're doing something with it, there's no tangible reward to that. So if you're trying to start this culture shift, think about it in little pieces and think about it as a cycle. It's almost like a chicken and the egg thing. What comes first, the data cleaning or the data reporting? And I think in most of our organizations, the reporting is happening, the analyst is taking on the cleaning piece, but you can democratize that and bring the rest of the organization into it. And then just grow this cycle so that people are thinking about the data governance as they're thinking about the reporting. And one of the things that I've kind of observed, and one of the ways that you can kind of kick off this data governance piece, is to bring a vendor in to talk about the benefits of data governance, or use a vendor service to kind of get you started on the data governance piece, but back that up with better reporting, better analysis, so that that interest stays and people kind of pick up on that data governance culture going forward. Not the easiest thing in the world, but people get pretty excited about reporting and analytics. So if you can harness that excitement to get a little bit of help with your data cleaning, your data governance, tends to be a pretty good way to get things going.
Good, thanks, Evan. That's a great point, and that's one of the things that we find. You know, our as you guys probably know, our tool is analytics and visualization tool. But one of the biggest benefits to the visuals is that it gives data governance like something tangible, right? So it's not just an academic exercise. People can kind of see that the things that they're doing with governance, if they put the time in to clean up, you know, that it really does improve the kind of results and the kind of output that they can get access to. So that helps a lot and kind of feeds into the cycle that we're looking at here. All right. So what do you have? What do you have for us, Catherine?
Well, so speaking of harnessing newfound interest in analytics and using it to kind of push our data governance agenda, I wanted to share this example from NCARB that's a KPI dashboard that got reimagined as part of COVID. So on the left is the original KPI dashboard, just the top chunk of it so that it's readable on the screen, but basically a report that updates every day, and I think had some weekly subscribers to it, but is basically tracking, that little spark line is like a 10-year trend, and then the bullet chart is progress versus last year. And these are fiscal years for us. So we end in the end of June. But so it was giving this like, 10-year trend and this like year over year look. And it was not a terribly popular report, despite ostensibly having really important business information. But I hadn't managed to really engage a user with it to figure out, kind of why isn't this taking off? And so when the pandemic started taking over our lives, there was this renewed interest in the KPI report that we sort of seized on and said like, yes, what are you looking for? And so we got a chance to work with the end user and kind of talk through it and develop this dashboard on the right, which goes out every Monday as an email. And instead of looking at those big, like long lead time trends, it's just looking at week to week, how we're pacing year over year. And so it's giving folks what feels like very up to the minute or up to the week information. And I think some of what's driving this is certainly that we're in a, unprecedented time. Like there's a lot of change and a lot of unknown going on, but it's a very data forward crisis that we're in. So folks are seeing data day in and day out on COVID and on the different outbreaks and epicenters. And so in some ways, I think it's having this kind of subliminal message that data is an essential component to adapting to and surviving this phase.
Great point. So I'm going to go ahead and go to our next topic. If you have any questions about any of that, go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A. But the next thing that we're going to talk about is data mapping, data identification and mapping, to be more specific. So I'm actually started off with a question, and I'll pose it to both of our panelists. What do you guys mean by it? What do you mean by data identification and mapping? And isn't this something that the IT guys do?
I'll kick it to Catherine first.
All right.
So, I mean, it is nice to have a cross-functional team involved in the effort. So yes, the IT guys could help. But what we're looking for here is just figuring out what assets you have. I think increasingly folks are getting used to talking about data as a business asset, just like anything else. And this is about making sure you understand where it is, what it is, how it is, and who owns it. The same way it makes sense to have an inventory of all the computer equipment at your organization.
Fair.
So I'll continue on that from the kind of analyst perspective. It is really, really complicated to create reporting and analytics on data that you don't know exists. So when you're sitting down to help answer a question with you using data, it's important to know what you have available, both so that you can address that question, but if the option is to go out and get that data you need, making sure that you're not putting undue burden on your members through surveys, or any other kind of groups by requesting data that already exists somewhere, you just really don't know it's there. So to come up with a broader picture of what your organization can accomplish with your data, it's really important to first kind of figure out what you have, what it represents, where it lives, and then what you can do with it.
Okay. So along those lines, right? I mean, part of mapping is understanding what's what data is available and where it lives, but within maybe also within an integration context. What kind of comments would you have about that?
So I think you've outlined 3 really good points on this slide. When you're thinking about data mapping, and this is also one of those data governance things that does not need to be very complicated. This is not you have to have a vendor, you have to have a separate system to track all of this stuff. This is a like talking to people and keeping an Excel spreadsheet starter activity. But you can think about 3 main elements to this. So within key systems, what data do you have there? How is that data structured? What does that data represent? When you go to pull reports out of that system, you can use those 3 questions to define what you can include in that reporting. From the source system standpoint, you're really starting to expand and identify all of the source systems for your organization. So maybe where you're really focused on your AMS, that's your only like real data source, you're likely pulling in data from a bunch of other source systems. You can move beyond thinking about what data is in your AMS to thinking about what those source systems are, what they capture, what they represent, what the currency of the data is. And what we're currently doing at ASHA is we're kind of figuring out who the owners of those source systems are, not to necessarily assign data governance tasks to, hey, you own the LMS, here's how we want it cleaned. But if we want information on what's in the LMS that we don't have access to, I want to know who to email or who to call or who to Zoom, or typically I'd walk into their office and just like demand my data, but that doesn't seem to work so well right now. But through this mapping process, you can kind of come up with a repository that identifies all of these data sources, what's in them, and who you really have to bug to get access to them. And you can take that to the next step where you're looking at integration. So where is the data flowing between these systems? You've got an LMS, you've got a CMS, maybe they're dumping data into your AMS, and that might be the most association-oriented sentence I've ever said. But understanding how they integrate, what data is coming over, at what level of analysis it's coming over. Is it just members? Is it members and non-members? Are you getting data from, say, your website that includes anyone that stumbles across it? And start mapping how all of these systems really work together. And you'll have a really, really good picture of what data you have access to, where it is, what it represents, what you can do with it, and you can use that to guide your reporting and analytics approach.
Good. Thanks, Evan. Yeah, so I'm going to go to Catherine now, and maybe you can tell us a bit about some of what NCARB is doing regarding mapping data and sort of integrating data between systems for analysis.
Yeah, so we have, I kind of put together like a little more simplified doodle for our data biome for the purposes here, because I think this is actually a really great exercise to be undertaken right now, especially when we're having a lot more conversations about the types of data that exist across the organization that folks are suddenly more interested in having analyzed. Like, this is a fabulous opportunity to at least start a data map as like a sketch paper, you know, back of the envelope kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a big, intimidating, must complete 100% type effort. It can be a pretty, you know, easy project to complete during these times, like your spice cabinet. But yeah, so I mean, just starting with something like this, right? Like figuring out what your different pieces are, drawing the lines to show where they go. And then, you know, next steps are like some of the things Evan was talking about, labeling the connectors with how that information is being matched across the two systems, information on how frequently it's going. Does it flow one direction, or does it also write anything back to that system? And then, yes, most importantly, who do I go to when I have questions?
Good, and I think it's really important. I'm actually really pleased that you did a simple diagram like this. I mean, this is like, you've seen some of these things that are really complicated. They're swim lanes and all sorts of complicated arrows going this way and that. And I mean, you may get to something like that eventually, but just conceptually, you know, thinking through how your data sources interact with each other, like which directions the data is flowing and things like that. I mean, that's something that you could sit down, you know, and draw on the back of a napkin, or just, you know, make a very simple diagram like this. So that's, yeah, I think this is really helpful. So the other thing that we need to be able to do, you know, besides the mapping and identification, is we want to be able to slice and dice our data in meaningful ways, right? Meaning that, you know, things like demographics and stuff that we all know about, but there is other characteristics, right? Metadata and things like that we want to be able to use to categorize things for analysis. So that kind of brings us to our next topic, and it's taxonomy and content tagging. So I thought about, you know, doing another poll to see who'd started on a taxonomy project, but I think I know what the results of that one would have been. You know, but it's things like, you know, I always think about, you can see in the background there, it's like the 5th grade version of the, you know, kingdom, phylum, class, and all of that. I always think of that when we talk about taxonomy. So you start from things that are not very similar, and kind of as you go down through the levels, you get more and more similar. So I'm going to start this one. I'm going to kick it back to Catherine for just a second, just for all of us here that, you know, maybe we don't know. What is a taxonomy in this context, and why is it important for us to have it?
Yeah, so first of all, King Philip came over for green spaghetti is still how I remember the classification for the animal kingdom. So yeah, so taxonomy in this case, what we're talking about really is creating effectively partially a metadata layer on top of a source, and ideally across sources. So just the same way that you might say, tell me about this individual member in these different contexts, in our LMS, in our email marketing system, in our survey data. You might want to say, instead of looking at this person or group of people, I want to look at this content topic, or I want to look at this other entity that we can group logically, that we want to see how it's performing in different places. So this idea of a taxonomy project is giving you additional information that you can use to isolate things for analytics, and kind of power up your ability to find the types of things that are going to be relevant to an analysis at hand, without having to go manually through a bunch of stuff and make a bunch of judgment calls on what's actually related.
Cool. Yeah, so we get a chance to ask a lot of associations about whether they have an organization-wide taxonomy. Most cases, the answer is no. If anyone is in the small minority of organizations that are really doing good things with their taxonomy, I'd love to hear about it in the chat, and I'm sure others on the call would like to know about that as well. But one of them is ASHA, so I'm going to turn it over to Evan, and he's going to tell us about the taxonomy project that they have underway.
Yeah, the real key phrase there is will be ASHA, not is ASHA. We're in the middle of a taxonomy project right now, which we kicked off July-ish of last year, in an effort to better classify the content that we hold across the organization. So we identified our kind of major content buckets that we wanted to work with, which were our publications content, our learning resources, the session presentation resources that we have from convention, and one that I'm completely blanking on right now, which is kind of annoying. Anyway, we wanted to be able to classify these by their topics in a really standardized way. And to do that, we needed to assign a fixed taxonomy to these. Now, ASHA had a taxonomy in place for a couple of years that was it stopped being used around 2014, 2015, when we switched over to a new CMS that could handle that taxonomy. So our publications team had a project that they've been kicking around for taking all of the publications content and working with a vendor to reassess the taxonomy and rebuild the taxonomy. We kind of jumped on board with that process and applied it out to our other content buckets. So while we're using our publications content as kind of a basis for the taxonomy is being informed by all of these other content buckets, and then applied across all of these content buckets. And the fourth bucket is our web content, by the way. I finally came up with it. The goal was to be able to quantify how members are using resources based on specific topic sets. So, we might know that we've got a lot of traffic to a particular web page, but we don't really know what that web page represents without having this unified taxonomy. And then in the end, we want to be able to use this taxonomy for a couple of reasons. We want to have a content information system that identifies all of our content grouped nicely by topic across the organization. We want to be able to look at how that content is being utilized and what topics are being hit the most or most in demand. We want to be able to take our individual member actions and link those back to a specific topic or keyword from the taxonomy. And we also want to be able to use our taxonomy and all of our tagged content to eventually develop another kind of unstructured data tagging algorithm that can take our taxonomy and use it as essentially key phrases to attach to unstructured data like our community data, so that we can quantify that data along the same terminology.
All right. So Catherine, to Evan used to term their unstructured data. So for the benefit of some of the people on the call, we're just going to ask you to sort of clarify what's meant by that, and tell us about anything that's relevant for what NCARB is doing related to getting insight from unstructured data.
Yeah, I mean, I think unstructured data is really kind of feels at least kind of like the next frontier right now that a lot of us are moving into. We have tons of it, but it's not, while there are some tools in some ways that you can just attack it in its native form, the easiest way to work with unstructured data is to, structure it, So we are, at NCARB, we've done a few different things around like topic modeling for our phone calls. So like taking the audio recordings and having a computer listen to them and tell us what it was about. And then, combining that with the information from the agent disposition after hanging up. Unfortunately, in our case, going back to the poll at the very beginning with lack of time being a big frustration, most of our efforts are still in the sandbox stage at this point. We don't have anything that's like operational and happening day to day all the time. But there's a lot to play with here, and there's a lot of value to be found if you can kind of get the right mix of structure to put on top of your, like Evan said, community data, survey data, anything like that, so that you can do analytics for it without having to rely on a human coming in and reading and interpreting all of that raw text.
Cool. Great, thank you for that. So for the last thing that I want to touch on, it's kind of wrapping up a few of the things we talked about, right? There's a lot of unstructured data here. We've talked about surveys a little bit. I saw some comments in the chat about survey fatigue and things like that. So a last major piece of content I want to talk about is a kind of an ambitious project that ASHA recently undertook, and it was a COVID-based member survey. So I'm going to turn it over to Evan to tell you about that.
Hey, so our most recent attempt at playing with unstructured data actually was driven by necessity. We fielded our first member COVID survey towards the end of March. We fielded to 211,000 people, got about 38,000 responses back. But that survey contained 5 open text strings, of which we got close to 100,000 text responses back from our membership. And this was the real meat of the survey. Those questions were asking, what ASHA can do to help support in this time, how the pandemic is affecting individuals, and then kind of another comments field. And we needed to quickly digest this data as an organization to figure out how to best serve our membership. Now, our typical approach to open text strings would have been to pretty much export them, put them in a PDF document, supply them to the people that needed to review them. And our surveys team calculated that going that approach, the PDF would print out on about 7 reams of paper. And it wasn't a process that the staff in the organization were going to be able to undertake quickly and get the information that they needed from that process. So we turned to a key phrase tagging approach. Now, what we have right here is one of the actual responses from the survey, how the pandemic is impacting one of our particular members. And if you want to go to the next slide, Bill. We took this string and, well, we took all the strings, but this one in particular, and passed it through a key phrase tagging algorithm that's part of Azure's cognitive services platform, Azure being Microsoft's cloud platform. And this is something that really anyone can do with a credit card. You can sign up and get an Azure account. It costs right now $2 to process 1,000 text strings. You can pass the text strings through an API call using Power BI, which is what we used for this. We're now using a Python program to do the pass. But what you'll get back is for every single text string that you pass through, the algorithm will highlight what it thinks to be the key phrases in that chunk of text. These are the phrases that the algorithm pulled out for this particular chunk. The most relevant ones to us were patients, were services, were outpatient, state maybe, and then it's got some other stuff. But we can start using these tags to quantify all of our text strings. So what we wound up doing is using the tagging to create a word cloud that we put in a Power BI workbook that both showed the overall like themes, the really high level, most frequent terms that we were seeing across these text responses. But the word cloud will also act as a filter for all of the open text strings. So we provided this tool to the organization. We've got a series of filters on the side that allows segmentation of the survey data down to a particular population. So our professions team for speech language pathologists could limit the dashboard to just responses from SLPs. If they want to see where they're currently working, say hospitals, they can do that too. Now you've dropped I think this question itself had around 30,000 unique respondents. You've dropped that down to maybe like 4,000 respondents. And now you can work with the word cloud to say, select all text strings that have to deal with patients. Now you've limited that number even further. You can export that list of text responses to someone who's specifically concerned with how SLPs are approaching patients under the pandemic. Now maybe they're reviewing 800 text responses instead of trying to comb through 30,000 text responses really quickly. So the tagging allows us to put a metadata layer, as Catherine said, on top of all of this unstructured open text that we can then start to quantify. We even, in the end, pulled all of the key phrases and ranked them to look at the frequency of full phrase hits. And the organization has found this to be particularly useful for digesting this data. I think we have about 50 users right now working in this dashboard. And we've just completed the second COVID survey. We'll be releasing that one to the membership within the next week, or not the membership, to the staff within the next week or so.
So Evan, tell us, give us an idea for how long it took to go from sending out the survey to getting some useful insights from this data versus how long that might have taken, with the old methods.
Yeah, definitely. This was actually a really quickly fielded survey. I think it went out on a Monday. We closed it the following Sunday, so it was only in the field for a week. We sent one notification email, no reminders. We got the full data export that Monday, and we had the dashboard up and running with the key phrase tagging by Thursday or Friday of that week. So it's something that can be turned around really, really quickly. We had this out to the staff within, I don't know, a little over a week for folks to pull those themes, that knowledge out of these text strings that are most relevant to the groups of the memberships that they serve.
Awesome. Yeah, so this is really good stuff. It's not as complicated as it looks. So I think it's kind of achievable and accessible for most of the people on the call. And one other point that we wanted to make is, Evan did it using Azure Services and Power BI. It can also be done with other tools. There's Survey Gizmo and Survey Monkey and some other lighter weight survey tools that have some capabilities to do this sort of thing. So we got just a couple minutes left. What I want to do now is give 2 takeaways, right? So first, we're going to go through kind of things that you can do right now, right? So even if you haven't really started with any of this stuff, some things that we can start on right now as action items. So I'm going to turn this one to Evan, and then we're going to let Catherine close with some closing thoughts.
Yeah, so going back to the theme that this stuff does not have to be super complicated. You can totally take your tiki drink out onto the back porch with some scratch paper and start working through some of these, and you're going to be better off in your data processes for it. So think about the key business questions across your association. Start with 3. What are 3 key business questions for your association, and what data do you currently have that you can use to answer those? What data do you think you need to be able to provide even more in-depth answers to those? And just document them, write them down, think about them as you go through these other items. Start to work on your data inventory. Start with the data that you use on a daily basis. Document it, document the data sources, document the uses, document what the data source represents. And then, go talk to your neighbor on Zoom and see what they use and start documenting that. Try and grow this across the organization so you've got a good idea of what data is being used, what data you have, and what you can do with it. Think about how this data flows through your organization. Do you have overlapping data points in these data sets? Are you conflating your kind of source data with the data that's integrated with your AMS? Are there differences in how that data would work in reporting? There are kind of a lot of kind of bottlenecks in the reporting process that you can work out by thinking about where the data is coming from and where it's actually stored. Form a working group within your organization to think about business intelligence and data governance. Now, we've tried to do this with 2 different groups. We've got a data scientist group, which is the kind of more data nerdy people. We just get together once a month and we talk about needs, talk about things that we want to work on, talk about new techniques that we'd like to kind of employ and try out. And then engage these folks as your champions to help roll out your data governance strategy. Because it's going to be the data users that benefit the most from the data governance. Think about a business glossary, define your key terms. Start with the term member. How do you define members? I mean, we define it in like 5 different ways, depending on what team you're talking about. So you want to pull a list of all members? Cool, what team requested that? Because that's really going to tell us what we're trying to pull. Try out some data visualization tools. I mean, Power BI and Tableau are both phenomenal tools and they're both free to start with. Go in, plug in an Excel spreadsheet that you're familiar with, that you understand, that maybe you've worked with before, and see what new insights you can pull out of that using a data visualization tool. It's kind of a different way to think about your data. And if you're using a data source that you understand, that it can be fun. Yeah, I'm a data nerd. That's fun. And experiment with your unstructured data. Like a lot of times, unstructured data just gets kind of thrown into a black hole where we don't really know what to do with it at this point. Think about ways that you can start to quantify that. Even, how many times does a single member post in the community? They're creating unstructured data, but that frequency is a quantifiable data fact. But think of other ways that you can turn that into quantifiable data that can roll into your analytics.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Evan. So so just some conceptual takeaways just to wrap us up here. We'll give Catherine 1 more minute, and thanks for hanging out with us today.
I'll talk real fast.
Yeah.
I think most of these up here speak for themselves, right? I think the projects Evan and I have talked about today can sound kind of intimidating or like a very academic effort. But the reality is that they're all things that you can break down into small chunks and take an MVP approach to getting something together, just something, and then taking that and shopping it around, getting some feedback and developing it further. So, you know, the ones that we've put on the screen here, the first one's arguably probably the one that's the most easier said than done, especially right now as we're, you know, this thing's coming at us from all direction. But I think it's really important for us to not lose sight of building time into our either days, weeks, months, years, decades for experimenting and innovating, like Evan was talking about, just trying something a little different. And then, yeah, start simple, start now. You don't have to have a vendor or a slick tool. There can be a lot of different ways to take kind of a low budget approach. And the team approach is a big piece of it too. It's nice, first of all, to have collaborators when you're experimenting, but it's even better when you've got a built-in set of cheerleaders ready to help you build adoption once you've got a product to roll out to the organization. And then, yeah, work on actually doing something that a lot of us on the like tech side of things find uncomfortable, but like, you know, puff out your chest and talk about this incredibly cool thing you built and why it's going to make everybody's lives better. You have to get into that self-promotion sort of space, which some of us do find uncomfortable, myself included, but it is a part of it. You've got to be able to talk about what you did and why folks should be using it.
Well, thank you very much. That was great information. Catherine, Bill, Evan, thank you so much. And thank everybody in the audience for listening. I hope your minds are full and your cups are empty. Join us for our upcoming events listed here. And next week, join us as I have a virtual discussion with Reggie and a few others on reaching members with timely and relevant communications. Thank you again for a fabulous discussion and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.